Welcome back. Reading Chapter 5 in Primitive Mythology by Joseph Campbell. Chapter 5 is entitled The Ritual Love Death. We're in Section 2, The Mythological Event. The leading theme of the primitive village mythology of the Dema is the coming of death into the world, and the particular point is that death comes by way of a murder. The second point is that the plants on which man lives derive from this death. The world lives on death. That is the insight rendered dramatically in this image. Moreover, as we learn from other myths and mythological fragments in this culture sphere, the sexual organs are supposed to have appeared at the time of this coming of death. Reproduction without death would be a calamity, as would death without reproduction. We may say then that the interdependence of death and sex, their import as the complementary aspects of a single state of being, and the necessity of killing and eating, for the continuance of this state of being, which is that of man on earth, and of all things on earth, the animals, birds, and fish, as well as man, this deeply moving, emotionally disturbing glimpse of death as the life of the living is the fundamental motivation supporting the rites around which the social structure of the early planting villages was composed. As Professor Jensen has observed, killing holds a place of paramount significance in the way of life of both animals and of men. Every day men must kill to maintain life. They kill animals, and apparently in the culture here being considered, the harvesting of plants was also regarded quite correctly as a killing. In this culture, he continues, killing is not an act of heroism, conceived in the spirit of warlike manliness. All of the details of the headhunt speak to the contrary. In fact, if the actions of the headhunter were to be judged by heroic standards, we should have to call him a coward. Nor, on the other hand, is either the mythological first killing that was perpetuated on the holy moonbeam, or the repetition of that killing in the cult, whether in the village ceremonials or in the actions of the headhunt, murder, in the sense of a criminal act meriting punishment, as Cain's slaying of Abel would appear to have been. It is true that the first killing brought about by a complete transformation of human life in the time of the beginning, and that in the myths this is occasionally represented in terms of a crime and its punishment. For psychologically, a certain sense of guilt cannot be separated from the act of killing, any more than from that of begetting. Yet the mere fact that a repetition of the deed is a sacred obligation placed upon mankind makes it impossible to call it murder in the full sense of the word. Guilt and heroism do indeed appear in some of the mythological representations of the episodes, but are certainly not essential to the basic context, which cannot but have been much more elementary. The closest analogy is to be found, according to my opinion, he then suggests, in the world of the beasts of prey. We do not think either of heroism or of murder when considering their manner of killing, but only of the primal force of nature. There is actually an indication of this parallelism in the appearance of spirits resembling beasts of prey in the ceremonies of the men's secret societies and puberty rites, as well as in the express statement of the people of West Saram that they derived their ritual of the headhunt from a bird of prey. But all of this touches only the problem of the psychological attitude towards killing. That killing should have assumed such a prominent position in the total view of the world in this culture sphere, I should like to refer quite specifically to the occupation of these people with the world of the plants. There was here revealed to mankind, in some measure, a new field of illumination. For the plants were continually being killed through the gathering of their fruits, yet their death was extraordinarily quickly overcome by their new life. Thus, there was made available to man a synthesizing insight, relating to his own destiny to that of the animals, the plants, and the moon. And so once again, as in the instance of the cosmic imagery of the hieratic city-state, we have an intellectual, emotionally toned insight as the fundamental inspiration of a cult that became basic to a sociology. There is no way in sheerly economic terms to account for the phenomenology of a primitive social system in which a tremendous proportion of the time and energy is given to activities of an elaborate ritual nature. The rites are expected to afford economic well-being and social harmony. That is true. Yet their inception cannot be attributed to an economic insight or even to a social need. Groups of 100 souls or so do not require the murder of their own finest sons and daughters to enable them to cohere. This flowering of rites derived from a cosmic insight, and one of such force that the whole sense, the formal structuring principle of the universe, seemed for a certain period of human history to have been caught in it. The rites were representations of this accord, in a way comparable to those formulae of modern physics through which the modes of operation of inscrutable cosmic forces become not only accessible to the mind, but also susceptible to control. They function both for man's enlightenment and for the furtherance of his aims. They are physical formulae, written, however, not in the black on white of, say, an E equals mc squared, but in human flesh. And the individuals rendering it are not individuals anymore, but epiphanies of a cosmic mystery, and as such, taboo, hence ceremonially decorated and symbolically, not humanly, regarded and treated. The harmony and well-being of the community, its coordination with the harmony and ultimate nature of the cosmos, of which it is a part, and the integration of the individual, in his thought, feeling, and personal desires, with the sense and essential force of this universal circumstance, can be said, therefore, to be the fundamental aim and nature of the ceremonial. And in a society of the sort here being considered, everyone is more or less deeply implicated in the context of the ceremonial in every moment and phase of his life. Let us say, then, to summarize, that a mythology is an organization of images conceived as a rendition of the sense of life, and that this sense is to be apprehended in two ways. Namely, the way of thought, and two, the way of experience. As thought, mythology approaches, or is, a primitive prelude to science, and as experience, it is precisely art. Furthermore, the mythological image, the mythological formula, is rendered present here and now in the rite, just as the written formula E equals mc squared here on this page is not merely a reference to the formula that Dr. Einstein wrote on another piece of paper somewhere else, but actually that formula itself. So likewise are the motifs of the rite experienced not as references but as presences. They render visible the mythological age itself, for the festival is an extension into the present of the world-creating mythological event through which the force of the ancestors, those eternal ones of the dream, became discharged into the rolling run of time, and where what then was ever present in the form of a holy being without change, now dies and reappears, like the moon, like the yam, like our animal food, or like the race. The divine being, the Dhamma, has become flesh in the living food substance of the world, which is to say in all of us, since all of us are to become in the end food for other beings. This is a nuclear idea of the killed Dhamma, who is the source of our good and of our food. A number of infantile motifs have been enlisted in the rendition, but the idea itself cannot be called infantile. It is in fact a new insight, fostering not a return to infancy, but a willed affirmation of man's fate and of the ruthless nature of being, to which we today, with our much more sensitive, humanized, and humanistic responses of revulsion, may be said to be reacting in the more childish way. The qualm before the deed of life, which is that of dealing death, is precisely the human crisis here overcome. The beast of prey deals death without knowledge. Man, however, has knowledge and must overcome it to live. Among the primitive hunting societies, the way was to deny death, the reality of death, and to go on killing as willing victims the animals that one required and revered. But in the planting societies, a new insight or solution was opened by the lesson of the plant world itself, which is linked somehow to the moon, which also dies and is resurrected and moreover influences in some mysterious way still unknown the lunar cycle of the womb. Through modern science, mythology has been refuted in practically all its details. Yet, in its primary insight into the presence and operation of common laws throughout the fabric of the universe, laws including human life as well as the kingdoms of the animals, plants, and heavenly spheres, it announced not only the main theme, but also the chief source of the fascination of science, and perhaps of life itself. Moreover, when the will of the individual to his own immortality has been extinguished, as it is in rites such as these, through an effective realization of the immortality of being itself, and of its play through all things, he is united with that being in experience in a stunning crisis of release from the psychology of guilt and mortality. Among the tropical planters, the rendition of this fundamentally religious experience was effected through rites of the kind that we have observed. And I think it may be said that if one of the chief problems of man philosophically is that of becoming reconciled in feeling as well as in thought to the monstrosity of the just so of the world, no more telling initiatory lesson than that of these rites could have been imagined. As Professor Jensen has pointed out, the number of lives offered up in such rites is far less proportionately to the population than that sacrificed in our own cities in traffic accidents. However, among ourselves, such deaths are thought of and experienced generally as a consequence of human fallibility, even though their incidence is statistically predictable. In the primitive ritual, on the other hand, which is based on the viewpoint of the species rather than on that of the individual, what for us is accident is placed in the center of the system, namely sudden monstrous death, and this becomes therewith a revelation of the inhumanity of the order of the universe. And in addition, what is thus revealed is not simply the monstrosity of the just so of the world, but this just so as a higher reality than that normally sensed by our unalerted faculties. A God-willed monstrosity in being, and retaining its form of being only because a divinity, a daemon, is actualizing itself in the entire display. Mythology, we may conclude, therefore, is a verification and validation of the well-known as monstrous. It is conceived, finally, not as a reference either to history or to the world texture analyzed by science, but as an epiphany of that monstrosity and wonder of these, so that both they and therewith ourselves may be experienced in depth. And in the sacrifices through which the major themes of such a mythology are made manifest and present, there is no sense of do et des, I give that thou mayest give. These are not gifts, bribes or dues rendered to God, but fresh enactments here and now of the God's own sacrifice in the beginning, through which he, she, or it became incarnate in the world process. Moreover, all the ritual acts around which the village community is organized, and through which its identity is maintained, are functions and partial revelations of this immortal sacrifice. And finally, it would seem evident that something of this primitive yet profoundly conceived mythology must underlie the larger celestially oriented constellation that we have already noted in our view of the hieratic city-state. In a mythologically oriented primitive society, such as those of the Marindanim and West Siamese, every aspect of life and of the world is linked organically to the pivotal insight rendered in the mythology and rituals of the age of the Dema. Those pre-sexual, pre-mortal, ancestral beings of the mythological narrative lived the idyll of the beginning, an age when all things were innocent of the destiny of life in time. But there occurred in that age an event, the mythological event par excellence, which brought to an end its timeless way of being and effected a transformation of all things, whereupon death and sex came into the world as the basic correlates of temporality. Furthermore, and in contrast to our contemporary evolutionary view of the unfolding of forms in time, the mythological notion was of a single, unique, and critical moment of definitive precipitation at the close of the paradisial age and opening of the present, when all things were given precisely the forms in which we see them today. The animals, the fish, the birds, and the plants in their various species, as well as the spirits and the ritual customs of the group. In the book of Genesis, we find much the same idea. But in the primitive version of the mythological event, which is represented in the book of Genesis in inverted order, Cain's murder of Abel following instead of preceding our first parents' eating of the fruit, one does not feel that mankind was cut off as a result of the killing of the Dema Hanueli. On the contrary, the Dema, through man's act of violence, was made the very substance of his life. Something of the sort can be felt in the Christian myth of the killed, buried, resurrected, and eaten Jesus, whose mystery is the ritual of the altar and communion rail. But here the ultimate monstrosity of the divine drama is not stressed so much as the guilt of man in having brought it about. And we are asked to look forward to a last day when the run of this cosmic tragedy of crime and punishment will be terminated and the kingdom of God realized on earth as it is now in heaven. The Greek rendition of the mythology, on the other hand, remains closer to the primitive view, according to which there is to be no end or even essential improvement for this tragedy, as it will seem to some, or play as it appears to the gods. The sense of it all, or rather nonsense of it all, is to be made evident forever in the festivals and monstrous customs of the community itself. But it is evident also and forever in every part and moment of the universe, for those who have been taught by way of the rites to see and to know the world as it is truly. So we'll stop there. Next time, we'll pick up with section 3, entitled Persephone. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.